In this video I want to show you something called, or what I call, consciousness ladder. So let's zoom in here. This is a representation of a concept of everything, which I call the all. We're talking about consciousness, and really the only consciousness that I have access to is my own consciousness, my consciousness. And if I want to conceptualize, starting with this concept of the all, I must first divide the all into things that are conscious and things that are not conscious. So some people say that everything is conscious, but I think it's unreasonable to assume that everything is like me, i.e. conscious. So I'm going to assume that there is such a thing as non-conscious, which I'll come back to later. So there's consciousness, and if we scroll down a bit more, then we can see that I have divided into human consciousness and non-human consciousness. Now, I think it's unreasonable to assume that every consciousness is the same, especially cross-species. So, I am familiar with human consciousness because I am a human. But I also accept that there are non-human consciousnesses which are not like mine. So I've divided them, or they're not necessarily like mine. So finally we reach my consciousness and the consciousness of other people. And I think it is reasonable to assume, since we are both the same species, that my consciousness and the consciousness of other people are similar, unlike my assumption up here, which accepts that there might be differences. So, continuing down the ladder, my consciousness is my experience. So when I experience something, a thing is a perceived thing. But I also have to acknowledge that there must be something doing the experiencing, which I have labelled here as the perceiver, which I'll come back to later. Now, in terms of what is perceived, generally speaking, there can be internal perception and external perception. And we intuitively have a grasp of this. We understand what is accessible to others and what is not accessible to others. And that is the difference between those two. Continuing down the ladder again, internal perception, things that are not accessible to other people. The perception of the body, my feeling of my body, is not accessible generally to other people. Neither is my mental perception. So I'm talking about thoughts and things like that. Mental perception, I've divided into perception of dreams and perception of thoughts. And the difference being that dreams are immersive and thoughts take place whilst awake. Some people say that being awake is basically the same as dreaming, and I agree broadly with that, but there is a major difference. As I said at the beginning, I think there's non-conscious things in the world and other consciousnesses in an actual world, and therefore when I'm awake, I'm experiencing those. Whereas when I'm asleep, when I'm dreaming, when I'm immersed into myself, it's only myself that I experience, although I don't experience it as myself necessarily, but it is only myself. So perceptions of thoughts, these are waking mental constructs. I've divided into logical thought and illogical thought. The difference being that logical thought works from axioms, and therefore if one agrees with the basic axioms and the thought is logical, then you have the ability to communicate persuasively to someone else who agrees with those axioms. So let's zoom out again. So this diagonal here is the ladder. This is an exploration of consciousness. You could probably divide it up in other ways, but I've divided it up this way. So I want to go back to some of the things up here on the ladder. Let's go back to non-conscious. non-conscious things. Now, the only reason I know of the possibility of non-conscious things is because I have an external perception. And in my external perception, I can perceive things which are not, which I believe are not conscious. Of course, I cannot definitely prove that they're not conscious. So things that are inanimate, like rocks and things like that, things that don't do anything if you just leave them, I believe they to be non-conscious objects. So much of the environment around me is non-conscious. Not all of it. Because, as I mentioned, there are consciousnesses that are non-human. And again, the only reason I know or I think they exist is because of external perception. So there's an element of perceiving non-human consciousnesses. And finally, other people's consciousness, which I have previously mentioned I assume similar to mine. So perceiving the consciousness of other humans. Well, how can I perceive someone's consciousness? Well, let's look at my consciousness. I have a perception of my body and my mental perceptions. So if I wish to perceive someone else's consciousness, I must do so via either their body or through communication. They have to reveal to me what is in their mind through some form of communication. Now, if I'm going to look at their body, then I have really two options. I can look at it, as I just said, or I can use the method of touch and feel directly. Finally, what about this perceiver? The perceiver of the perceived. The I within I. Well, I have an internal perception. Can I perceive the perceiver? It's worth trying. So, there's my ladder of consciousness. I just wanted to show you this because it informs the way I think about consciousness at this present point in time.